In the early months of 1937, Heinrich Himmler was at his alpine home along one of Bavaria's most beautiful lakes, and he was waiting for a visitor. This visitor was Walther Wust. He was the dean of the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. Himmler had called him for a meeting. Heinrich Himmler was the Reichsführer of the SS, one of the deadliest wings of the Nazi party. He was the chief of the Nazi police under Hitler's leadership of the German Reich, and more importantly, he was in charge of the concentration camps which had been set up by the Nazi regime. Himmler had one more area of interest, and it was in that connection that he was seeking to meet this dean of the university. The Nazis were fascinated with the idea of the origin of the Aryan race. They fancied themselves to be inheritors of the Aryan ethnic identity, and they wanted it to be preserved against what they called the un-Aryan ethnic identities. And one of the questions that the Nazis always faced was, where did the Aryans come from? One of the theories was that the Aryans had definitely come from Europe, they had come from Germany, but then they had moved eastwards. And when they moved eastwards, they went to the Caucasus, and then they went further down to India's fertile plains, and they settled in those fertile plains of India. Another theory floated by a racial theorist called Hans F.K. Gunther, one of many racial theorists that the Nazis had, was that the Nordic heroes, these Aryan heroes on their horsebacks, they had left Europe in the ancient past, and on their horses they had traveled to Iran, and then from Iran to Afghanistan, and then from Afghanistan they had come to India's plains and settled there. Gunther and other racial theorists had said that after they settled there, they had studied deeply and become scholars. These were blonde-haired Germans, blonde hair, very fair looking, with long oval faces, sharp noses, ears of a certain kind, very handsome, and they had come and settled somewhere in India, and they had studied philosophy. And it is these so-called Aryans who had written some of Hinduism's philosophical texts like the Upanishads. But what had happened was that they came from a cold climate, and the fertile plains were very hot. India was generally very hot. So in the end, what they did was they went to the Himalayas to settle there, and specifically they went to the eastern part of Tibet and settled there. That was one of the Nazi theories. And Himmler had this theory in his mind. The other Nazis also had this theory in their minds, and they were discussing what they should be doing about it. Now let's answer this basic question: why did the Nordic Europeans come to the east in the first place? Now again, there was another theory attached to it, and that was about the sinking of the island of Atlantis. Atlantis was this fancy island that these theorists had thought about. It was supposed to exist somewhere between England and Portugal in the Atlantic Ocean, and that was where the Aryans were from. But one fine day, because of a thunderbolt from the sky, the island began to sink, and because it began to sink, the Aryans left that place, and then they came all the way eastward and settled in India. So that's how they moved eastward. So these inhabitants of the so-called island of Atlantis were supposed to have finally settled on top of the roof of the world, as Tibet was known. So this is a basic idea we need to keep in mind when we are going to start the story of Himmler and his meeting with this academic from the University of Ludwig Maximilian in Munich. It's a very reputed university in Munich. So Himmler calls him, and Walther Wust arrives. And what does Walther Wust have in his hand? He has a copy of the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda is one of the ancient texts of the Hindus. There are 4 Vedas in all, and the Rig Veda is supposed to be the oldest of them all. And Walther Wust read parts of the Veda for Himmler and translated it into the German when they were speaking, and sort of convinced him that this text was actually created by the Nordic people. And Himmler was fascinated by the idea. What happens is that Himmler thinks about this idea, mulls over this idea in his head, quickly appoints Walter Wust as in charge of an organization that he has set up. Now this is the most important part here. Himmler had in 1935 set up an organization within the SS. It was called the Ahnenerbe, or the Bureau of Ancestral Heritage. The idea of this Ahnenerbe, or the Bureau of Ancestral Heritage, was to study the origins of the Aryan race and to find out where the Aryans came from, where they went. So it was all part of Himmler's program of action. And after this meeting with Wust, Himmler started thinking along these lines, what can be done? In the meanwhile, Himmler met a young zoologist who was in his mid-20s called Ernst Schaefer. He had also joined the Nazi party and he had also joined the Ahnenerbe. Himmler called him, and he called him because Schaefer had been already to Tibet and had conducted an expedition as a zoologist. So Himmler called him and said, why don't you go to Tibet and to the Himalayas as a whole and find out if we can find traces of the origins of the Aryan race there. Schaefer found the idea fascinating, and Himmler said, I'm putting you head of the expedition. There will be 5 people who will go. You will be the number 1 among those 5 and you will lead the expedition. There will be an ethnographic expert, there will be an anthropologist, there will be a filmmaker who will film things, and the idea is do as much scientific research as possible about the origins of the Aryan race and see if you can find any traces of Aryanhood among the people still there. So Schaefer found this very interesting, and Schaefer put together a team of 5 people. The other important member of this team was Ernst Beger. Beger, B-E-G-E-R. He was an anthropologist and an ethnologist. An ethnologist is somebody who knows and studies ethnic groups, the origins and development of these groups. So he was an ethnologist and he was an anthropologist. So Schaefer, Beger and 3 others, they left for the Himalayas and specifically for Tibet. Now India was in the hands of the British. This team landed in Colombo and from there they wanted to go to Calcutta. So they headed for Calcutta and reached there. But from there they wanted to go to Tibet. Would they get permission to film there, take photographs? And what Beger wanted to do was, he wanted to make casts of people. So that's what anthropologists often did. They made casts of human features. Hair, it could be hair, heads, it could be skulls, cranial features, it could be noses, it could be ears. And they wanted to take lots of photographs and study them. They wanted to take actual measurements of people's ears, their eyes, the distance between the eyes, the size of the nose, the shape of the nose, everything, because they wanted to identify traces of the Aryan race. It was all a transparently bogus science, but they were all involved heavily in it and they believed truly in this so-called science of theirs. So the British were obviously very wary. It was already 1938. The team arrived in Calcutta in 1938 and tensions were already happening in Europe. Hitler had already taken over Austria. He was about to swallow Czechoslovakia. He had taken the Sudetenland. The rest of Czechoslovakia was under threat. So the British first thought, is this a bunch of spies that's arrived here? And then the report was sent to London to Chamberlain, to Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister. But he was in the business of appeasing Nazi Germany and he wanted peace at any cost. So he said, okay, let's allow them to go to Sikkim in the first place. So they were allowed to go to Sikkim. Sikkim was an independent mountain kingdom at the time. Sikkim was not a part of British ruled India. It was a mountain kingdom with a king and a queen. So this team first went to Sikkim and they went to the capital of Sikkim, Gangtok. where they started photographing people. They started making masks with plastic casts and other types of casts. I'll get to those other types of casts very soon. And filming people, their habits, taking measurements, and they took plenty of measurements. Soon they got permission to go to the Tibetan kingdom, and that was because just by pure luck they got to meet one of the members of the royal family of Tibet, and he put them in touch with the Tibetan Council of Ministers, which was then in charge. The Tibetan Council was in charge because the Dalai Lama had died in 1933, and the new Dalai Lama who had been found was only 3 years old. So there was a Tibetan council ruling in the name of the Dalai Lama, and the regent was in charge. So this regent allowed them to go to eastern Tibet, and Beggar and Schaefer, they started going around Lhasa and other parts of Tibet, a place called Yarlung where the ancient Tibetan kingdom was based. They went all over this place for several months, and Beggar took precise measurements of people's noses, or the shape of their noses, the size of their noses, their eyes, their ears. He took pictures of their cranial features, he measured their cranial features, and importantly, he took casts. Now, these were not plastic casts. These were made of a soft substance called nelog, and that was a soft substance. It was heated and put on a person's face. So it was put on a Tibetan person's face, for example, and it was allowed to be there for about 10 minutes. And in 10 minutes, it settled on the face and it sort of dried up. And when you took it off, you got a nearly perfect cast, a mask, a really good mask, better than a plastic mask of that period. And when another liquid substance was added to that cast, you got a positive. So you really had a cast, a mask that looked like a real feature of a person. So Beggar went about doing all these things. The photographer went around taking pictures. They took 40,000 pictures in all. The filmographer went around filming people, and they got 18,000 meters of film recorded for themselves. A total of 40,000 photographs were clicked, and features and measurements of 376 Tibetans were taken. Casts were made of 17 people, 2 of them of the so-called royal lineage. That was important because people thought that it was not the hoi polloi, it was not the masses who were from the Aryan race, but the ruling classes. They were part of the Aryan race. And importantly, why did the Nazis think that they will only find traces of the Aryan race and not the Aryan race itself? Because the theory was that once the Nordic Germans, the white, blonde-haired, fair people from Europe came to India and went to the Himalayas, first they kept their distance from the indigenous population, from the local population, because they were superior in intellect, in looks, in blood. They were blue-blooded Aryans. And the local population, they believed, was inferior. So that is where, according to the German races, the Varna system came into place. So the Nordic Germans, the so-called Aryans, became the Brahmins, and the others were members of the other castes. Now, for a long time, according to the German racial theorists, these Nordic guys, they kept their distance from the local population. But in time, they started mixing racially. They started marrying the local population. And because of that, according to these races, their blood actually got contaminated and they were no longer blue-blooded. So they lost their sense of Aryanness, and the whole Aryan race lost its heroism. And so you could find only traces of Aryanness there, not fully Aryan people. But they wanted to know the traces so that they could recreate that Nordic type once again in Germany and in the German Reich, and then rule the entire earth. Then Hitler could rule all of the world. Now, while they were doing this, they did this for several months, Schaefer and Beggar and their team. Soon it was the summer of 1939, and war clouds began to loom all over Europe. And Himmler then wrote to them, and Schaefer also wrote to Himmler. Himmler said, "Come back now, because if you get stuck there, you're going to be in trouble." And Schaefer realized if they got stuck there and war began and they were stuck, then they would be taken into custody by the Britishers, by the British regime in India, and they would be arrested and imprisoned in India, and they would be there until the end of the war. Who knows, they might even get killed in prison by the British if the war dragged on for long. So they hurried up, they took a plane, they had come by boat to Colombo, but they took a plane from Calcutta back to Germany, and guess who was there to receive them at the Munich airport when they landed? Heinrich Himmler himself. And he welcomed them. He was thrilled to see all those cars and photographs and everything they had taken. War broke out soon, and then all these activities stopped. But all this research material was still in the hands of the Nazis right through the war. After the war, Schaefer was imprisoned for a little while for being a Nazi, but just for a short period. And then he was on the list of denazified Germans. There were Germans who were denazified by the forces that came in and liberated Germany later in 1945. So he was on the list of denazified Germans. Beger's story is interesting. After he came back in 1939, Beger was a much sought after person because the Nazis had set up a series of concentration camps. The deadliest camp, as we all know, was Auschwitz. And Beger was called to this camp in 1943 to take measurements of Jews there so that the inferior races could be identified. Again, take the same measurements, make similar casts, and he did all that work in the Auschwitz concentration camp. For that, he was imprisoned for 3 years after the war and accomplice to murder. But he was after that set free. This is the bizarre story of how the Nazis actually came to India and to the Himalayas and Tibet to find traces of the origins of the Aryan race. It was all fanciful theory, but they spent more than 60,000 German Reichsmarks on this expedition of 1938-39, and they did all sorts of crazy things. Himmler built his ANNRB, the Bureau of Ancestral Heritage, which did this crazy kind of pseudo-scientific research. And interestingly, they thought the origins of the Aryan race were in India, and that's how they went about doing that. Thank you. That's it from me for the moment. If you like this, please do subscribe to my channel if you still haven't, and press the bell button for notifications on my latest videos. Thank you.